The phone rang at 2:47 a.m., jolting me awake from the first peaceful sleep I'd had in months. The caller ID showed a number I hadn't seen in 8 months, a number I'd memorized from years of dutiful daughter calls, medical emergencies, and family obligations. My mother's number. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, remembering the last time we spoke when she told me I was no longer welcome in her life because I'd questioned her decision to make my younger sister Lisa her primary caregiver instead of me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Rodriguez, and at 32 years old, I never imagined I'd be completely cut off from my own mother while watching from the sidelines as my sister destroyed everything our family had built. I'm a registered nurse at Banner Health Medical Center in Phoenix, Arizona, where I've worked for the past 8 years, building a career dedicated to caring for others. The irony wasn't lost on me that I spent my days ensuring other people's mothers received proper medical care while being banned from providing the same for my own. 8 months ago, everything changed when my mother, Patricia, fell in her Scottsdale retirement community and fractured her hip. At 68, she was dealing with diabetes, high blood pressure, and now mobility issues that required constant attention and care coordination. As the older daughter with medical training and a stable financial situation, I naturally assumed I'd step into the caregiver role that I'd been preparing for my entire adult life. I'd researched the best specialists, understood her insurance coverage, and had already started modifying my work schedule to accommodate her needs. But my mother had other plans. During what I thought would be a family meeting to discuss her care options, she announced that Lisa would be moving in with her to serve as her primary caregiver. Lisa, who at 29 had never held a steady job for more than 18 months, who had declared bankruptcy twice, and who thought that checking blood sugar levels meant asking if the cookies tasted sweet enough. My mother's reasoning was simple and devastating. Lisa needed the financial support more than I did, and as the younger daughter, she deserved the chance to prove herself responsible. I tried to explain gently that caregiving wasn't about proving responsibility, but about having the skills and knowledge to keep someone safe and healthy. I outlined the complex medication schedules, the importance of monitoring her diabetic condition, and the reality that Medicare and supplemental insurance required careful navigation to avoid costly mistakes. My mother's response was to accuse me of being controlling and jealous of my sister's opportunity. The breaking point came when I suggested we hire professional in-home care to supplement whatever help Lisa could provide. My mother's face hardened in a way I'd never seen before, and she told me that if I couldn't support her decision, I was no longer welcome in her home or her life. She accused me of undermining Lisa's confidence and trying to make my sister feel inadequate. The woman who had raised me to be independent and capable was now viewing those very qualities as threats to her preferred daughter's success. Lisa moved into the spacious 2-bedroom apartment at Sunset Manor Retirement Community that following week. My mother's savings account held approximately $180,000, money she'd carefully accumulated through decades of teaching elementary school and investing wisely with my father before his death 5 years earlier. The monthly costs for her care, including the retirement community fees, medications, and medical appointments, typically ran around $4,500. With careful management, her savings could last several years while providing a comfortable lifestyle. I tried to maintain some connection by calling the retirement community's front desk to check on her welfare, but the staff had been instructed not to share any information with me. My attempts to reach out through mutual friends from church were met with reports that my mother seemed happy with her decision and that Lisa was doing her best. The few updates I received painted a picture of mother and daughter bonding over cooking shows and afternoon walks around the community's gardens. Meanwhile, my own life continued with the hollow ache of separation. My husband David watched me struggle with the rejection, offering support while fighting his own frustration with my mother's treatment of me. He'd witnessed years of my dedicated, Attention to my parents' needs, the way I'd researched every medication change and accompanied them to important medical appointments. He'd seen me spend countless hours helping them navigate insurance claims and organizing their financial documents to ensure they were prepared for exactly this type of situation. The hardest part wasn't just the separation from my mother, but the knowledge that my medical training could genuinely make a difference in her quality of life. I understood the warning signs of diabetic complications, knew when blood pressure readings required immediate attention, and could identify medication interactions that might cause dangerous side effects. These weren't skills that could be learned quickly or through good intentions alone. But my mother seemed convinced that love and dedication were sufficient qualifications for medical caregiving. During those 8 months, I threw myself into my work with renewed intensity. I volunteered for extra shifts and took on additional training in geriatric care, partly to distract myself from the family situation and partly because every elderly patient reminded me of what I couldn't do for my own mother. My colleagues noticed my increased dedication, but they also saw the sadness I carried. My supervisor, Dr. Amanda Chen, had become something of a confidant during this time, listening to my concerns about my mother's situation and offering perspective from her own experience with family caregiving challenges. Dr. Chen had met my mother several years earlier when I brought her to the emergency department for a severe reaction to a new blood pressure medication. She remembered my mother as intelligent and caring, but also noted her tendency to make decisions based on emotion, rather than practical considerations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When I confided about the current situation, Dr. Chen expressed concern about the medical supervision my mother was receiving, but acknowledged that there was little we could do unless my mother chose to seek our help. The retirement community where my mother lived was generally well regarded, with an on-site clinic and nursing staff available for emergencies. However, the level of daily monitoring and medication management my mother required needed more intensive oversight than the community typically provided. I'd researched their protocols thoroughly and knew that they relied heavily on family members to coordinate external medical care and ensure compliance with treatment plans. My sister Lisa had always been the family member who needed rescuing. Throughout our childhood and into adulthood, she'd found herself in various predicaments that required financial assistance or family intervention. She'd dropped out of college, twice, accumulated significant credit card debt, and had a pattern of quitting jobs when they became challenging or when conflicts arose with supervisors. My parents had consistently enabled this behavior, viewing it as supporting their youngest child through difficult times, rather than recognizing it as a pattern that prevented her from developing crucial life skills. When Lisa moved in with my mother, I genuinely hoped that the responsibility might provide the structure and purpose she'd always seemed to lack. I wanted to believe that caring for our mother could be the catalyst for positive change in her life, even if it meant accepting my own exclusion from the situation. The optimistic part of me imagined that perhaps my mother's intuition about Lisa's potential was correct, and that given the opportunity, my sister would rise to meet the challenge. But as the months passed without any contact, I found myself wondering about the practical realities of their situation. Was Lisa managing the complex schedule of medications that kept my mother's diabetes stable? Did she understand the dietary restrictions that were crucial for maintaining proper blood sugar levels? Was she recognizing the early warning signs of the complications that could arise from my mother's various health conditions? The not knowing was perhaps the most difficult aspect of the entire situation. As a healthcare professional, I was accustomed to having access to information, to being able to monitor and adjust care plans based on changing conditions. Being completely shut out from my mother's medical situation felt like watching a train approach a broken bridge without being able to warn the passengers. My husband David had initially supported my decision to respect my mother's wishes and maintain distance, but as time passed, he began expressing more concern about the situation. He'd researched elder financial abuse and shared statistics about family members who took advantage of aging relatives' trust and resources. While I didn't want to believe that Lisa would deliberately harm our mother, I couldn't ignore the possibility that her financial irresponsibility might create problems for both of them. The Phoenix area has a large population of retirees, and through my work at Banner Health, I'd seen countless families navigate the challenges of elder care. I'd witnessed the devastating consequences of inadequate medical supervision, from preventable hospitalizations to medication errors that caused serious complications. I'd also seen families torn apart by disagreements over care decisions and financial management. My professional experience made my personal situation even more frustrating because I knew exactly what could go wrong, but I was powerless to prevent it. During my shifts in the hospital's geriatric unit, I found myself paying extra attention to patients whose family dynamics resembled my own situation. I observed how family members with good intentions but limited knowledge sometimes made decisions that seemed caring but actually compromised their loved one's health and safety. I saw adult children struggle with the balance between respecting their parents' autonomy and ensuring their well-being. These observations reinforced my understanding of how complex caregiving relationships could become, especially when multiple family members had different ideas about the best approach. The retirement community where my mother lived was located in one of Scottsdale's more affluent areas, surrounded by golf courses and upscale shopping centers. Sunset Manor marketed itself as providing an active lifestyle for independent seniors, with amenities like a fitness center, social activities, and optional meal services. The community was designed for residents who were largely self-sufficient, but wanted the security of having assistance available if needed. It wasn't intended as a facility for residents requiring intensive medical supervision or daily living assistance. I'd researched the community extensively when my parents first considered moving there several years earlier. The monthly fees covered basic services like maintenance, utilities, and access to common areas. But additional care services were billed separately and could quickly become expensive. The on-site medical clinic was staffed by nurse practitioners who could handle routine issues, but referred more complex medical situations to outside specialists. For someone with my mother's multiple health conditions, this level of care might be sufficient if properly coordinated with external physicians, but it required a knowledgeable advocate to ensure nothing fell through the cracks. The financial aspect of my mother's situation had been another source of concern during those 8 months of separation. I knew approximately how much money she had available and understood the monthly costs associated with her lifestyle and medical needs. With careful management, her resources should have been sufficient to maintain her current living situation for several years. However, I also knew that unexpected medical expenses or poor financial decisions could quickly erode those savings, potentially forcing difficult choices about her future care options. Lisa's historical relationship with money had never demonstrated the kind of careful planning and restraint that managing someone else's finances required. She'd always lived paycheck to paycheck when she was employed, and during periods of unemployment, she'd relied on family assistance to cover basic expenses. The idea of her having access to my mother's financial accounts and making decisions about expenditures felt like putting someone who'd never successfully managed their own budget in charge of preserving another person's life savings. But despite all my concerns and professional knowledge, I'd respected my mother's decision and maintained the distance she'd requested. I'd focused on my own life, my marriage, and my career, while hoping that somehow everything would work out for the best. I'd convinced myself that perhaps I was overthinking the situation, that my medical training was making me overly cautious about risks that might never materialize. That rationalization lasted exactly 8 months, until my phone rang at 2:47 a.m. with the number I'd been forbidden to call. I answered the call with a trembling voice, knowing that nothing good came from phone calls at this hour. My mother's voice was barely recognizable, weak and desperate in a way I'd never heard before. She was crying, something she rarely did even during my father's illness and death. Between sobs, she managed to tell me that she was at Banner Health, emergency department, the same hospital where I worked, and that Lisa had disappeared 3 days ago with her debit cards and checkbook. The story that unfolded over the next 20 minutes was devastating in its predictability. My mother's savings account, which had contained nearly $180,000 8 months ago, was now overdrawn by $1,500. The retirement community was threatening eviction for unpaid fees that hadn't been settled in 3 months. Her diabetes medication had run out a week ago because Lisa hadn't arranged for the prescription refill, and her blood sugar levels were dangerously high when the paramedics found her unconscious in her apartment. As I listened to my mother's broken explanation, I felt a mixture of heartbreak and vindication that left me feeling sick to my stomach. Everything I'd feared might happen had come to pass, but knowing I'd been right provided no satisfaction. When the consequences were my mother's health and financial security, she begged me to come to the hospital, saying she had nowhere else to turn and that she'd made a terrible mistake in cutting me out of her life. I hung up the phone and immediately called my supervisor to explain that I had a family emergency and wouldn't be able to work my scheduled shift that day. David, who had been awakened by the conversation, offered to drive me to the hospital since my hands were still shaking from the shock of the call. During the 30-minute drive from our home in Tempe to the medical center, I tried to prepare myself mentally for what I might find when I arrived. The emergency department was unusually quiet for a Friday morning, and I found my mother in bed number 12, looking smaller and more fragile than I remembered. Her hair, which she'd always kept perfectly styled, was unwashed and tangled. Her skin had the grayish pallor that indicated poor blood sugar control, and she'd clearly lost weight since I'd last seen her. The sight of her in such a vulnerable state immediately dissolved any anger I might have felt about the months of separation. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the attending physician on duty, recognized me from my work in the hospital and approached with a mixture of professional concern and personal sympathy. She explained that my mother had been brought in by paramedics after a neighbor at the retirement community found her disoriented and barely conscious. Her blood glucose level was over 400, indicating severe hyperglycemia that could have been life-threatening if left untreated for much longer. The medical team had stabilized her condition with insulin and IV fluids, but Dr. Walsh was concerned about the broader pattern of neglect that had led to this crisis. My mother hadn't been taking her medications consistently, her diet had been poor, and there were signs that she hadn't been monitoring her blood sugar levels at all. The doctor asked if I knew anything about her living situation and whether there had been adequate supervision of her medical care. I explained the family situation as diplomatically as possible, focusing on the fact that my sister had been serving as my mother's caregiver, but had apparently left without warning. Dr. Walsh nodded knowingly, mentioning that they saw similar cases regularly where well-meaning family members took on caregiving responsibilities they weren't equipped to handle. She emphasized that my mother would need intensive monitoring for the next several days, and that her living situation would need to be reassessed before she could be safely discharged. My mother's eyes filled with tears again when I approached her bedside. She reached for my hand with fingers that felt cold and frail, apologizing repeatedly for the way she'd treated me and begging for my forgiveness. She explained that Lisa had been sweet and attentive for the first few months, cooking meals and helping with daily activities, but that problems had started appearing around the 4-month mark. According to my mother, Lisa had begun making increasingly expensive purchases, claiming they were necessary for my mother's care or comfort. She'd bought a new television, expensive organic foods, and had taken several trips to Las Vegas that she'd described as medical conferences for caregivers. When my mother had questioned some of these expenditures, Lisa had become defensive and accused her of being ungrateful for all the sacrifices she was making. The financial abuse had escalated gradually. Lisa had started using my mother's credit cards for her own expenses, claiming she would pay everything back from her upcoming inheritance. She'd convinced my mother to add her name to the savings account as a joint owner, supposedly to make it easier to handle medical emergencies. By the time my mother realized how much money was missing, Lisa had drained most of the account and disappeared. The retirement community's business office had been trying to reach my mother about the unpaid fees for weeks, but Lisa had been intercepting the calls and assuring them that payment would be made soon. When the eviction notice was finally delivered in person, Lisa had promised to handle everything, but had instead packed her belongings and left without any explanation or forwarding information. My mother's voice broke as she described the terror of realizing she was completely alone and unable to care for herself. She'd been too proud and ashamed to contact me directly, hoping that Lisa would return or that she could somehow manage the situation independently. When she'd finally collapsed from the uncontrolled diabetes, she'd been unconscious for several hours before the neighbor had found her. As my mother continued her story, I felt my professional training kicking in alongside my personal emotions. I began making mental notes about the immediate steps that would need to be taken to address both her medical needs and the financial crisis. The medical situation was manageable with proper care and monitoring, but the financial damage would require legal intervention and careful planning to resolve. Dr. Walsh returned to discuss the treatment plan and discharge options. My mother's blood sugar levels were stabilizing, but she would need to remain hospitalized for at least 48 hours to ensure her condition was fully controlled. More importantly, the hospital's social services department would need to assess her living situation before approving her discharge, since returning to an environment without adequate supervision could be dangerous. I asked Dr. Walsh if I could speak with her privately about my mother's situation. In the hallway outside my mother's room, I explained my medical background and outlined my concerns about the broader pattern of neglect and financial abuse. Doctor, Walsh listened carefully and agreed that the situation required intervention beyond just treating the immediate medical crisis. She connected me with Margaret Foster, the hospital's social services coordinator, who specialized in elder abuse cases. Margaret explained that what my mother had experienced constituted both financial and medical neglect, potentially rising to the level of criminal elder abuse depending on the scope of Lisa's actions. She offered to help coordinate with adult protective services and law enforcement if my mother was willing to pursue those options. When I returned to my mother's room, I found her staring at the ceiling with tears streaming down her face. She looked at me with an expression of such profound regret and shame that it took everything I had not to break down myself. She whispered that she knew she'd made terrible decisions, and that she understood if I couldn't forgive her for the way she'd treated me. I pulled a chair close to her bedside and took her hand again, telling her that we would focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on past mistakes. I explained that there were both medical and legal steps we would need to take to address the current crisis, but that we would handle everything together. The relief on her face was immediate and overwhelming, as if she'd been holding her breath for months and could finally exhale. My mother then shared additional details about Lisa's behavior that painted an even more troubling picture. She described how Lisa had gradually isolated her from the few friends she'd made at the retirement community, claiming that they were gossipy and negative influences. Lisa had also discouraged my mother from participating in the community's social activities, suggesting that she needed to conserve her energy for more important things. The isolation had made it easier for Lisa to control information about my mother's condition and finances. She'd convinced my mother that I was too busy with my own life to be concerned about her well-being, and that reaching out to me would be an unwelcome burden. Lisa had positioned herself as my mother's only reliable support system while systematically undermining her confidence and independence. Most disturbing was my mother's description of how Lisa had handled medical appointments and medication management. She'd accompanied my mother to doctor visits but had often provided inaccurate information about symptoms and medication compliance. She'd filled prescriptions irregularly, sometimes claiming that certain medications were too expensive or unnecessary. When my mother had expressed concern about her fluctuating energy levels and increasing confusion, Lisa had dismissed these symptoms as normal aging. The picture that emerged was of someone who had systematically neglected my mother's medical needs while exploiting her financially. Whether Lisa's actions had been deliberately malicious or simply the result of incompetence, and selfishness didn't matter in terms of the consequences. My mother's health had deteriorated significantly. Her life savings had been depleted, and she was now facing the possibility of losing her home and independence. As the day progressed, various hospital staff members stopped by to check on my mother's condition and discuss next steps. The endocrinologist who consulted on her diabetes management expressed concern about the long-term effects of poor blood sugar control over the past several months. The hospital's financial counselor wanted to discuss insurance coverage and payment, options for her current hospitalization and future care needs. Each conversation reinforced the scope of the crisis that Lisa's actions had created. Beyond the immediate medical emergency, my mother was facing potential eviction, depleted savings, and the need for intensive medical supervision to prevent future complications. The cascade of problems that had resulted from Lisa's negligence would require months of careful planning and intervention to resolve. During a quiet moment, my mother asked about my life over the past 8 months. She wanted to know about my work, my marriage, and whether I'd been happy despite the family separation. I chose to focus on the positive aspects, describing professional achievements and personal milestones while avoiding any details that might make her feel worse about the time we'd lost. She listened intently, asking questions about my patients and expressing pride in my career accomplishments. It was clear that she'd missed being part of my life, and that the separation had been as difficult for her as it had been for me. She mentioned that she'd often wanted to call, but had convinced herself that I was better off without the complications of her situation. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Margaret Foster from Social Services, who wanted to conduct a formal assessment of my mother's situation. Margaret explained that the hospital was required to report suspected elder abuse to the appropriate authorities, and that my mother would need to decide whether she wanted to pursue criminal charges against Lisa or focus solely on civil remedies for recovering her stolen funds. My mother looked overwhelmed by the prospect of legal action against her younger daughter, despite everything that had happened. She struggled with the idea of involving law enforcement, worrying about the impact on Lisa's future, and questioning whether she might have somehow contributed to the problems by not being more vigilant about her finances. Margaret patiently explained that financial elder abuse was a serious crime that often escalated over time if left unaddressed. She described other cases where family members had started with small financial improprieties before eventually draining their elderly relatives' entire life savings. The pattern my mother described was unfortunately common, and early intervention was crucial for preventing further exploitation. I supported Margaret's recommendation that my mother at least file a police report to document what had happened, even if she ultimately decided not to pursue criminal prosecution. Having an official record of Lisa's actions would be important for insurance claims, civil litigation, and protecting my mother from potential future exploitation. The decision-making process was emotionally exhausting for my mother, who was still recovering from the medical crisis and trying to process the full scope of Lisa's betrayal. She alternated between anger at being taken advantage of and guilt about potentially destroying her younger daughter's future. The conflicting emotions were clearly taking a toll on her physical recovery as well. As evening approached, David arrived at the hospital with dinner and moral support. He'd taken the day off work to be available if needed, and had spent part of the afternoon researching elder law attorneys and financial recovery options. His practical approach to problem-solving provided a helpful counterbalance to the emotional intensity of the situation. My mother was visibly touched by David's presence and concern. She'd always liked him, but had seen relatively little of him during the family separation. His willingness to support both of us during this crisis seemed to reinforce her growing understanding of how much damage her decision to cut me off had caused to all our relationships. Dr. Walsh stopped by during evening rounds to check on my mother's progress and discuss plans for the following day. Her blood sugar levels were responding well to the insulin regimen, but she would need continued monitoring and education about proper diabetes management. The doctor also wanted to schedule appointments with both an endocrinologist and a cardiologist, to address the potential long-term effects of the medical neglect she'd experienced. The conversation turned to discharge planning and living arrangements. Returning to the retirement community was problematic, both because of the unpaid fees and because my mother was no longer able to live independently without assistance. The hospital's discharge planners would need to explore options ranging from in-home care services to assisted living facilities, depending on my mother's preferences and financial resources. As visiting hours ended and David headed home, I made arrangements to stay overnight in my mother's room using a reclining chair that the nursing staff provided for family members. My mother expressed relief at not being alone, admitting that she'd been afraid to sleep since Lisa's disappearance because of nightmares about being abandoned again. The night shift brought a different energy to the hospital floor, with dimmed lights and quieter conversations. My mother and I talked intermittently, between her periods of rest, covering topics we'd been unable to discuss during the months of separation. She shared details about her daily life with Lisa, describing moments of genuine companionship alongside growing concerns about her caregiver's behavior. I learned that my mother had suspected problems much earlier than she'd initially admitted, but had been reluctant to acknowledge them because it would have meant admitting that I'd been right about Lisa's unsuitability as a caregiver. Her pride and stubborn determination to prove that she'd made the correct decision had prevented her from seeking help when intervention might have minimized the damage. The honest conversation was both healing and heartbreaking. We were reconnecting, as mother and daughter, while simultaneously confronting the devastating consequences of choices that could have been made differently. The lost time, the preventable health complications, and the financial destruction had all resulted from a family conflict that should have been resolved through communication rather than separation. The next morning brought a whirlwind of activity that would determine my mother's immediate future and possibly expose the full extent of Lisa's actions. Dr. Amanda Chen, my supervisor and mentor, stopped by during her rounds despite this not being her assigned unit. She'd heard about my family emergency through the hospital network and wanted to offer both professional guidance and personal support during what she recognized would be a challenging time. Dr. Chen's presence brought an unexpected revelation that changed everything about how we would proceed. She informed me that Lisa had actually brought my mother to the emergency department twice in the past 3 months, both times for diabetes-related complications that should have been prevented with proper care. Lisa had provided false contact information and claimed to be my mother's only family member, explicitly stating that there were no other relatives available for consultation. The medical records from those visits painted a disturbing picture of escalating neglect. During the first visit, my mother's blood sugar had been dangerously low, suggesting either medication errors or inadequate food intake. Lisa had explained that my mother was frequently confused about her insulin dosing and often forgot to eat meals. The attending physician had recommended closer supervision and possible placement in assisted living, but Lisa had assured them that she would increase her monitoring at home. The second emergency visit had occurred just 6 weeks ago, when my mother experienced severe dehydration and disorientation. Her blood pressure was critically low, and she showed signs of kidney dysfunction that could have been life-threatening if left untreated. Again, Lisa had dismissed the doctor's concerns about inadequate care supervision, claiming that my mother was becoming increasingly uncooperative and difficult to manage. Dr. Chen explained that the medical team had been concerned enough during that second visit to contact Adult Protective Services for a welfare check, but Lisa had somehow convinced the investigators that everything was under control. She'd apparently presented herself as a devoted daughter who was overwhelmed but managing adequately, while portraying my mother as an elderly woman experiencing normal cognitive decline who sometimes exaggerated her symptoms for attention. This information was devastating because it demonstrated that Lisa's neglect had been ongoing and escalating for months, not just the recent abandonment that had precipitated the current crisis. More importantly, it revealed that she had actively deceived medical professionals and social services to avoid intervention, while my mother's condition continued to deteriorate. I immediately requested copies of all medical records from those previous visits, knowing that they would be crucial evidence for both legal proceedings and insurance claims. Dr. Chen assured me that the hospital would cooperate fully with any investigation and that the patterns documented in my mother's care clearly indicated systematic neglect that rose to the level of criminal elder abuse. Margaret Foster from Social Services arrived mid-morning with Detective Robert Sullivan from the Phoenix Police Department's Elder Abuse Unit. Detective Sullivan was a veteran investigator who specialized in financial crimes against elderly victims, and his presence indicated that the hospital staff had already determined that criminal charges were warranted regardless of my mother's preferences about prosecution. Detective Sullivan's interview with my mother was gentle but thorough, covering not just the financial theft, but the pattern of medical neglect that had endangered her life. He explained that elder abuse cases often involved multiple types of harm, including financial exploitation, physical neglect, and emotional manipulation. Lisa's actions appeared to encompass all three categories, making this a serious felony case that the district attorney's office would likely pursue aggressively. My mother struggled with the implications of formal criminal charges, repeatedly expressing concern about destroying Lisa's future and questioning whether she might have somehow enabled the behavior through her own poor judgment. Detective Sullivan patiently explained that victims of elder abuse frequently experienced these conflicted feelings, but that holding perpetrators accountable was essential for preventing future crimes against other vulnerable adults. The detective's preliminary investigation had already uncovered additional concerning information about Lisa's activities. Bank records showed a pattern of escalating withdrawals and purchases that had nothing to do with my mother's care needs. Lisa had apparently been using my mother's debit card for online gambling, luxury purchases, and cash advances that totaled over $60,000 in just the past 4 months. More troubling was evidence that Lisa had been researching my mother's life insurance policies and investment accounts, suggesting that her plans extended beyond simply draining the available cash. Detective Sullivan indicated that this level of financial exploitation often escalated to more serious crimes if left unchecked, making intervention even more critical. During the detective's interview, my mother revealed additional details about Lisa's behavior that she'd been too ashamed to share earlier. She described instances where Lisa had threatened to leave if my mother questioned her spending or complained about the quality of care she was receiving. Lisa had repeatedly reminded my mother that she was the only family member willing to provide care and that alienating her would result in placement in a nursing home. The emotional manipulation had been particularly effective because Lisa had exploited my mother's fear of becoming a burden and her guilt about the family estrangement that had resulted from choosing Lisa as her caregiver. My mother had endured increasing levels of neglect and financial abuse rather than risk being abandoned entirely or having to admit that her decision had been wrong. Detective Sullivan's investigation had also uncovered evidence that Lisa had been in contact with multiple elderly residents at the retirement community, possibly identifying other potential victims for financial exploitation. The detective indicated that this pattern suggested organized criminal activity rather than opportunistic theft, which would result in more serious charges and potentially federal involvement if the scheme crossed state lines. The scope of the investigation was expanding beyond just my mother's case, and Detective Sullivan requested permission to examine all of her financial records and medical documentation to build a comprehensive case. He also wanted to interview staff members at the retirement community who might have witnessed suspicious behavior or been approached by Lisa with requests for information about other residents. As the morning progressed, the retirement community's administrator, Helen Morrison, arrived at the hospital to discuss my mother's housing situation and the outstanding fees that Lisa had failed to pay. Helen expressed genuine concern about my mother's condition and revealed that several staff members had been worried about the deteriorating care situation, but had been assured by Lisa that everything was under control. Helen explained that the community's policy required eviction proceedings when fees were more than 60 days overdue, but that they were willing to work with families in crisis situations if realistic payment arrangements could be established. However, the total amount owed now exceeded $15,000, including late fees and penalties, making immediate resolution necessary to prevent eviction. The financial crisis was more severe than initially apparent because Lisa had not only failed to pay the retirement community fees, but had also defaulted on several of my mother's regular obligations, including insurance premiums and utility bills. The cascade of unpaid bills would require careful prioritization to address the most critical needs first, while protecting my mother's credit rating and ensuring continued access to essential services. I spent part of the afternoon on the phone with various creditors and service providers, explaining the elder abuse situation and requesting temporary payment arrangements while the legal and financial issues were resolved. Most were sympathetic and willing to work with us, but the process of documenting the fraud and establishing new account access would take several weeks to complete. The hospital's financial counselor, Patricia Williams, met with us to discuss insurance coverage for my mother's current hospitalization and ongoing medical needs. Fortunately, her Medicare and supplemental insurance were still active because the premiums had been automatically deducted from her Social Security payments, which Lisa hadn't been able to access directly. However, the cost of intensive diabetes management and the additional medical supervision my mother would require going forward would strain her remaining financial resources. Patricia explained various assistance programs and payment options that might help bridge the gap while we worked to recover the stolen funds through legal proceedings. The reality of my mother's situation was becoming clearer as we gathered more information throughout the day. She would need significant financial assistance to maintain her current living situation, even if we could resolve the immediate crisis with the retirement community. The medical neglect had created ongoing health complications that would require expensive monitoring and treatment for the foreseeable future. More challenging was the emotional trauma of Lisa's betrayal and abandonment, which had shattered my mother's confidence in her own judgment and ability to make decisions about her care. She repeatedly expressed fear about trusting anyone else with her finances or personal information, while simultaneously acknowledging that she couldn't manage these responsibilities independently. Dr. Walsh returned in the afternoon with results from additional tests that had been ordered to assess the long-term effects of the medical neglect my mother had experienced. The news was mixed. Her kidney function showed some damage from the episodes of severe dehydration, but it appeared to be reversible with proper medical management. Her cardiovascular system showed signs of strain from the poorly controlled diabetes, but aggressive treatment could prevent further deterioration. The endocrinologist who consulted on her case emphasized that my mother's diabetes management would need to be completely restructured, with closer monitoring and possible changes to her medication regimen. The months of inconsistent care had made her blood sugar control more unstable, requiring a more intensive treatment approach than had been necessary before Lisa's involvement. The psychological impact of the trauma was also evident in my mother's behavior and emotional responses throughout the day. She alternated between periods of clarity and focus when discussing practical matters, and episodes of anxiety and confusion when confronting the emotional aspects of Lisa's betrayal. The hospital's psychiatric consultant recommended counseling to help process the complex feelings of grief, anger, and self-blame that were complicating her recovery. As afternoon turned to evening, we received unexpected news that would significantly impact our approach to resolving the crisis. Detective Sullivan called to inform us that Lisa had been located and arrested in Las Vegas, where she'd apparently been staying in expensive hotels and gambling with my mother's money. She'd been found with over $8,000 in cash and numerous items purchased with my mother's credit cards. The arrest brought both relief that Lisa could no longer continue her destructive behavior and new concerns about the legal process that would follow. Detective Sullivan explained that Lisa would be extradited back to Arizona to face charges, but that the recovery of stolen funds would depend on separate civil proceedings that could take months or years to resolve. More immediate was the question of whether Lisa's arrest would make her more cooperative about providing information needed to reconstruct my mother's financial situation. She had exclusive access to passwords, account numbers, and other information that would be essential for managing my mother's affairs going forward. The detective indicated that Lisa's cooperation might be influenced by the severity of charges she was facing and the strength of the evidence against her. If she chose to plead guilty and provide restitution, the criminal case could be resolved more quickly. But there was no guarantee that she would have the resources to repay even a fraction of what she'd stolen. As we digested this news, my mother's response surprised me with its mixture of relief and continued concern for Lisa's well-being. Despite everything that had happened, she worried about her younger daughter's fate and questioned whether there might have been underlying problems that contributed to her destructive behavior. The complexity of family relationships remained powerful, even in the face of serious betrayal and abuse. David arrived that evening with updates on the research he'd been conducting about legal options and financial recovery strategies. He'd consulted with an elder law attorney who specialized in abuse cases and had begun documenting the evidence we'd need to pursue civil remedies beyond the criminal prosecution. The attorney had emphasized the importance of acting quickly to freeze any remaining assets that Lisa might have access to, and to begin the process of establishing guardianship or power of attorney arrangements that would protect my mother from future exploitation. The legal framework for elder abuse cases was complex, but there were established procedures for helping victims recover both financially and practically from these crimes. That evening, as my mother rested more comfortably with her blood sugar levels finally stabilized, I reflected on how dramatically our situation had changed in just 24 hours. The phone call that had awakened me seemed like weeks ago, though we were still in the early stages of addressing the crisis that Lisa had created. The path forward would require months of legal proceedings, financial reconstruction, and medical monitoring. But for the first time since the family estrangement began, I felt hopeful about our ability to overcome these challenges together. My mother's willingness to acknowledge her mistakes and accept help had opened the door to rebuilding our relationship while addressing the practical consequences of Lisa's actions. As I settled into the hospital chair for another night of staying with my mother, I knew that the most difficult confrontations were still ahead. Lisa's return from Las Vegas would bring face-to-face accountability for her actions, and my mother would need to make definitive decisions about prosecution and financial recovery that would affect our entire family's future. 3 days later, my mother was cleared for discharge from the hospital with a comprehensive care plan that would ensure her medical needs were properly managed going forward. The transformation in her condition was remarkable, not just physically, but emotionally, as she began to regain confidence in her ability to make decisions about her own life. Dr. Walsh had coordinated with specialists to establish a monitoring system that would prevent future medical crises while giving my mother the independence she valued. The discharge planning process had revealed just how extensively Lisa's negligence had affected every aspect of my mother's life. Beyond the obvious medical and financial issues, we discovered that she'd been isolated from friends, had missed important medical appointments, and had been living in increasingly unsanitary conditions. As Lisa's attention to caregiving duties had deteriorated in favor of her financial schemes, Helen Morrison from Sunset Manor had agreed to a payment plan that would allow my mother to return to her apartment while we worked to resolve the outstanding fees. The retirement community's staff had been genuinely concerned about my mother's welfare and were relieved to learn that proper supervision would be restored. Several residents had quietly expressed worry about the changes they'd observed in my mother's appearance and behavior over the past few months. The legal proceedings were moving forward with surprising speed due to the overwhelming evidence of Lisa's financial crimes. Detective Sullivan had coordinated with Las Vegas authorities to document the gambling losses and luxury expenditures that clearly demonstrated intent to defraud rather than simple poor judgment about caregiving expenses. The district attorney's office had indicated that they would seek maximum penalties given the vulnerability of the victim and the systematic nature of the abuse. Most significantly, Lisa's arrest had triggered the discovery of similar schemes, involving at least 3 other elderly residents in the Phoenix area. Her pattern of targeting isolated seniors with substantial savings had been more extensive than anyone had initially realized, suggesting a level of criminal sophistication that would result in federal charges in addition to the state-level elder abuse prosecution. The revelation that Lisa had been operating what amounted to a criminal enterprise targeting vulnerable seniors had changed my mother's perspective on pursuing prosecution. Her initial reluctance to press charges had been based on viewing Lisa's actions as family betrayal, rather than recognizing them as serious crimes that endangered other potential victims. Understanding that her cooperation could prevent similar abuse of other families had given her the strength to fully support the criminal case. Detective Sullivan's investigation had uncovered detailed records of Lisa's activities, including notes she'd kept about various elderly individuals' financial situations and living arrangements. The evidence suggested that she'd been planning to expand her operations significantly, possibly moving to other states where similar retirement communities offered access to wealthy seniors without extensive family oversight. The financial recovery process was more complicated than the criminal prosecution because it required tracing funds through multiple accounts and transactions. The elder law attorney we'd hired, Marcus Rodriguez, explained that even successful criminal convictions didn't guarantee full restitution, especially when the perpetrator had gambling debts and no legitimate assets to recover. However, Marcus had identified several potential sources of financial recovery that offered hope for at least partial compensation. Lisa's car, which had been purchased with my mother's money, could be seized and sold. Her gambling activities in Las Vegas had been documented by casinos that were required to report large cash transactions, potentially making them liable for knowingly accepting proceeds from elder abuse. Most importantly, Lisa had purchased expensive jewelry and electronics that could be recovered and liquidated. The process of rebuilding my mother's financial security was complicated by the need to establish new banking relationships and security procedures that would prevent future exploitation. Marcus recommended that I be granted power of attorney for financial matters while maintaining my mother's autonomy for personal decisions, creating a system of checks and balances that would protect her assets without diminishing her independence. The retirement community's administrators had been cooperative in providing documentation of the fees Lisa had failed to pay, and were willing to testify about their observations of neglect and suspicious behavior. Helen Morrison had noticed that my mother's appearance and demeanor had deteriorated significantly over the past few months, but Lisa had consistently provided plausible explanations that had prevented more intensive investigation. More revealing were the accounts from other residents who had interacted with Lisa during her time at Sunset Manor. Several reported that she had asked detailed questions about their financial situations, family relationships, and medical conditions under the guise of friendly conversation. The pattern of information gathering had been so systematic that it was clear Lisa had been evaluating multiple potential targets for future exploitation. Dr. Amanda Chen had become an unofficial advocate for my mother's case, using her position at the hospital to coordinate with other medical professionals who had encountered Lisa during my mother's previous emergency visits. The medical community's response had been swift and decisive, with several physicians agreeing to testify about the pattern of neglect that had endangered my mother's life. The endocrinologist who was now managing my mother's diabetes care had been particularly disturbed by the evidence of medication mismanagement and failure to monitor blood sugar levels. She explained that the type of complications my mother had experienced were entirely preventable with proper care, and that Lisa's negligence could have resulted in permanent organ damage or death. Most importantly, the medical team had developed a comprehensive care plan that would prevent future health crises while allowing my mother to maintain her preferred living arrangement at Sunset Manor. The plan included regular monitoring appointments, medication management support, and emergency protocols that would ensure immediate intervention if problems arose. The psychological support services that had been recommended were proving equally valuable for helping my mother process the complex emotions surrounding Lisa's betrayal. The hospital's trauma counselor, Dr. Sarah Martinez, specialized in elder abuse cases and understood the unique challenges faced by victims who had been victimized by their own family members. Dr. Martinez explained that my mother's feelings of shame and self-blame were common among elder abuse victims, particularly when the perpetrator was a trusted family member. The counseling process would focus on helping her rebuild confidence in her own judgment, while developing strategies for recognizing and preventing future exploitation attempts. The support group for elder abuse survivors that Dr. Martinez had recommended provided my mother with connection to others who had experienced similar betrayals. Hearing stories from other victims helped her understand that Lisa's manipulation tactics were part of a recognizable pattern rather than evidence of her own poor judgment or gullibility. David had taken a leave of absence from his job to help coordinate the various legal, medical, and financial requirements that were necessary to stabilize my mother's situation. His project management background proved invaluable for organizing the complex documentation and scheduling required for the multiple proceedings that were running simultaneously. The family dynamics had shifted dramatically as relatives and friends learned about Lisa's actions and the crisis my mother had faced. Several family members who had supported Lisa's appointment as caregiver were now expressing regret about their previous skepticism regarding my concerns about the arrangement. My mother's sister in Tucson had been particularly supportive, driving to Phoenix to provide emotional support and help with practical tasks like organizing my mother's apartment and sorting through the financial documents that Lisa had left, scattered throughout the residence. The sight of the neglected living conditions had been shocking evidence of how completely Lisa had failed in her caregiving responsibilities. The retirement community's housekeeping staff had reported finding expired medications, spoiled food, and evidence that my mother had been struggling to maintain basic hygiene and nutrition during Lisa's final weeks of supposed caregiving. The documentation of these conditions provided additional evidence for both the criminal case and civil litigation. Marcus Rodriguez had filed preliminary motions to freeze any remaining assets that Lisa might have access to and had begun the process of recovering funds from financial institutions that had processed suspicious transactions. The legal strategy involved multiple approaches, including direct restitution through the criminal case, civil litigation for damages, and potential claims against third parties who had facilitated the financial abuse. The banking relationships were being completely restructured with enhanced security measures and dual authorization requirements for large transactions. Marcus had recommended a financial institution that specialized in serving elderly clients and provided additional protections against fraud and exploitation. The new banking arrangements included regular account monitoring by both the bank's fraud prevention team and an independent financial advisor who would review transactions for unusual patterns. These safeguards would provide early warning of any future attempts at financial exploitation while preserving my mother's autonomy for routine financial decisions. Most significantly, the experience had strengthened the relationship between my mother and me in ways that might not have been possible under normal circumstances. The crisis had forced honest conversations about family dynamics, personal values, and the importance of maintaining connections despite disagreements or hurt feelings. My mother had acknowledged that her decision to cut me off had been motivated, partly by pride and partly by fear that accepting my help would diminish Lisa's confidence and opportunities for growth. She now understood that protecting Lisa from the consequences of her poor decisions had actually enabled increasingly destructive behavior that had ultimately harmed everyone involved. The healing process was complicated by my mother's continued worry about Lisa's welfare despite the severity of her crimes. She struggled with conflicting feelings of anger about the betrayal and concern about Lisa's future, particularly given the serious criminal charges she was facing and the likelihood of significant prison time. Dr. Martinez had explained that These conflicted emotions were normal, and that resolution would take time as my mother processed the full scope of what had happened. The counseling process would help her separate her legitimate concerns about Lisa's well-being from any inappropriate sense of responsibility for the consequences of Lisa's criminal choices. The criminal case was proceeding rapidly due to the overwhelming evidence and Lisa's apparent decision to cooperate with prosecutors in hopes of receiving a reduced sentence. Detective Sullivan had indicated that her cooperation was providing valuable information about other potential victims and accomplices, which could prevent future crimes while supporting the prosecution's case. The media attention surrounding the case had been handled carefully to protect my mother's privacy while raising awareness about elder abuse prevention. Several local news outlets had reported on the case without identifying my mother personally, focusing instead on the broader issues of financial exploitation and the importance of proper oversight for vulnerable adults. The response from the community had been overwhelmingly supportive, with numerous people sharing their own experiences with family caregiving challenges and elder abuse concerns. The case had prompted discussions about the need for better training and oversight for family caregivers, as well as improved reporting mechanisms for suspected abuse. Marcus Rodriguez had been contacted by attorneys representing other potential victims of Lisa's schemes, suggesting that a class action approach might be more effective for recovering damages and preventing similar crimes in the future. The coordination between multiple cases would strengthen the evidence against Lisa while providing resources for comprehensive victim support services. The retirement community had implemented new policies for monitoring residents who might be at risk for abuse or neglect, including regular welfare checks and mandatory reporting procedures for staff who observed concerning changes in residents, conditions, or circumstances. Helen Morrison had acknowledged that the community's previous approach had been too deferential to family members without adequate verification of caregiving quality. As we approached the 1-week mark since my mother's emergency hospitalization, the immediate crisis had been stabilized, and we were beginning to see the outline of a sustainable, long-term solution. The medical monitoring system was working effectively, the financial security measures were in place, and the legal proceedings were advancing toward resolution. Most importantly, my mother was regaining her sense of agency and confidence in her ability to make decisions about her own life. The trauma of Lisa's betrayal and abandonment was still affecting her emotionally, but she was no longer paralyzed by fear and shame about what had happened. The experience had taught both of us valuable lessons about the importance of maintaining family connections, even during disagreements, and the dangers of isolating vulnerable family members from their support networks. We were committed to ensuring that nothing like this could happen again while preserving the independence and dignity that were so important to my mother's quality of life. 6 months after that terrifying phone call that had awakened me in the middle of the night, I stood in the courthouse waiting for the final sentencing hearing that would close this devastating chapter of our family's story. Lisa had pleaded guilty to multiple counts of elder abuse, financial exploitation, and fraud, sparing my mother the trauma of a lengthy trial while accepting responsibility for crimes that had affected not just our family, but at least 7 other elderly victims across Arizona and Nevada. The transformation in my mother's life during those 6 months had been remarkable and inspiring in ways I never could have anticipated when we first began dealing with the crisis. Her physical health had stabilized completely under proper medical supervision, with her diabetes now well controlled and her blood pressure returning to normal ranges. More significantly, her emotional recovery had exceeded everyone's expectations as she worked through the trauma with Dr. Martinez and rebuilt her confidence in her own judgment and decision-making abilities. The financial recovery had been more successful than Marcus Rodriguez had initially projected, thanks largely to Lisa's cooperation in identifying assets and accounts that could be liquidated for restitution. The sale of items purchased with stolen funds, combined with insurance settlements and recovery from gambling establishments, had restored approximately 60% of my mother's original savings. While not a complete recovery, it was sufficient to ensure her security and maintain her preferred living arrangement at Sunset Manor. The retirement community had become an unexpected source of support and advocacy for my mother throughout the recovery process. Helen Morrison and her staff had implemented new policies for protecting vulnerable residents while maintaining their independence, and my mother had become involved in developing training programs for staff to recognize early warning signs of potential abuse or neglect. The relationships my mother had rebuilt with other residents at Sunset Manor had been particularly healing for her emotional recovery. Many had shared their own experiences with difficult family dynamics or financial challenges, creating a support network that provided both practical assistance and genuine friendship. The isolation that Lisa had imposed had been replaced with meaningful connections that enriched my mother's daily life. Dr. Amanda Chen had continued to monitor my mother's medical care even beyond her professional obligations, serving as an informal advocate and mentor as we navigated the complex healthcare system. Her involvement had ensured continuity of care and helped establish the monitoring protocols that had prevented any recurrence of the medical crises that had characterized the period of Lisa's supposed caregiving. The legal proceedings had revealed the full scope of Lisa's criminal activities, which extended far beyond what any of us had initially understood. Detective Sullivan's investigation had uncovered evidence of a sophisticated scheme that had targeted elderly individuals across multiple states, with Lisa serving as part of a larger network of criminals who specialized in exploiting vulnerable seniors through fake caregiving arrangements. The federal charges that had resulted from this broader investigation carried significant prison time, and Lisa was facing a sentence of 8 to 12 years in federal custody, followed by supervised probation and mandatory restitution payments. The severity of the punishment reflected both the serious nature of her crimes and the devastating impact they had on victims who trusted her with their most basic needs and security. The other victims who had come forward during the investigation had formed an informal support group that met monthly to share resources and advocate for stronger protections for elderly adults. My mother had become one of the most vocal advocates in this group, using her experience to help educate others about warning signs of financial exploitation and the importance of maintaining family connections during caregiving arrangements. The civil litigation had also reached a successful conclusion, with settlements from several financial institutions and service providers who had failed to identify or report the suspicious transactions that had enabled Lisa's crimes. These settlements provided additional compensation for victims while establishing precedents that would strengthen protection for future potential victims of similar schemes. Marcus Rodriguez had worked with the victims group to establish a foundation that would provide resources for elderly abuse survivors and funding for prevention programs in retirement communities and assisted living facilities. My mother had been elected to the foundation's board of directors, giving her a meaningful way to channel her experience into positive change for others facing similar challenges. The psychological counseling that had begun during my mother's hospitalization had evolved into ongoing support that had transformed her understanding of family relationships and personal boundaries. Dr. Martinez had helped her recognize that setting appropriate limits and expectations was not only acceptable, but essential for maintaining healthy relationships with family members who might struggle with addiction, mental health issues, or criminal behavior. The most profound change had been in my mother's relationship with herself and her own sense of worth and capability. The months of Lisa's emotional manipulation had convinced her that she was becoming a burden who should be grateful for any assistance, regardless of its quality or cost. The recovery process had restored her understanding that she deserved respectful, competent care, and that her needs and preferences were valid and important. The family dynamics had been permanently altered by the revelations about Lisa's behavior and the crisis that had resulted from enabling her destructive patterns. Extended family members who had initially supported Lisa's appointment as caregiver had been forced to confront their own roles in creating the conditions that had made the abuse possible. Several relatives had reached out to my mother with apologies for their previous skepticism about my concerns and their failure to maintain independent relationships with her during the period when Lisa was controlling access and information. These conversations had been difficult but ultimately healing, as they addressed long-standing patterns of family dysfunction that had contributed to the crisis. My relationship with my mother had grown stronger and more authentic than it had ever been, built on the foundation of honesty and mutual respect that had emerged from surviving this crisis together. We had established new communication patterns that ensured regular contact while respecting each other's independence and autonomy. The caregiving arrangements that were now in place reflected lessons learned from the disaster of Lisa's appointment, while addressing my mother's actual needs and preferences. Professional home health services provided medical monitoring and assistance with complex tasks, while I maintained oversight of financial matters and medical decision-making through carefully structured legal arrangements that protected both of us. David had returned to his regular work schedule, but remained actively involved in the ongoing legal and financial matters that would continue for several more months. His support throughout the crisis had deepened our marriage and demonstrated the importance of having partners who could provide stability during family emergencies. The broader impact of our case had extended beyond our immediate family to influence policy discussions about elder abuse prevention and the regulation of family caregiving arrangements. Several state legislators had contacted Marcus Rodriguez about proposed legislation that would require basic training and background checks for family members who assumed caregiving responsibilities for vulnerable adults. The media coverage had been handled sensitively to protect my mother's privacy while raising awareness about the prevalence of elder abuse and the sophisticated methods that criminals use to exploit vulnerable seniors. My mother had agreed to participate in a documentary about financial elder abuse that would air on a national news program, using her experience to educate others about prevention and recovery. The retirement community had become a model for other facilities, seeking to implement better protection protocols while maintaining the independence and dignity that residents valued. Helen Morrison had been invited to speak at conferences about the balance between safety and autonomy in senior living environments. The financial institutions that had been involved in processing Lisa's fraudulent transactions had implemented new monitoring systems and training programs for employees to recognize potential elder abuse. These changes would provide better protection for future customers while establishing clearer procedures for reporting suspicious activities. The medical community's response had been equally significant, with hospitals and healthcare providers updating their protocols for identifying potential abuse and neglect among elderly patients. Dr. Walsh had worked with other emergency department physicians to develop screening tools that could identify patterns of medical neglect while respecting patient privacy and family relationships. The technology solutions that had been implemented to protect my mother's financial security had proven so effective that the bank was offering similar services to other elderly customers who might be vulnerable to exploitation. The monitoring, systems, and authorization procedures had prevented several attempted fraudulent transactions while allowing my mother to maintain control over her daily financial activities. As I stood in the courthouse that day, listening to the judge deliver Lisa's sentence, I reflected on how completely our family's story had been transformed by the crisis that had begun with that devastating phone call. The destruction that Lisa had caused had been extensive and painful, but it had also revealed strengths and resources that we might never have discovered under normal circumstances. My mother's victim impact statement had been powerful and dignified, focusing not on revenge, but on the importance of holding people accountable for their actions while working to prevent similar crimes against other vulnerable individuals. She had spoken about the healing that had come from rebuilding trust and relationships, and about her commitment to using her experience to help others facing similar challenges. The judge's comments during sentencing acknowledged the severity of Lisa's crimes while recognizing the remarkable recovery that the victims had achieved through their own resilience and the support of their communities. The sentence reflected both the need for punishment and the hope that Lisa might eventually take responsibility for the harm she had caused and work toward making meaningful amends. Outside the courthouse, my mother and I were approached by several other families who had been following our case and wanted to express their gratitude for our advocacy work. The connections that had been formed through this shared experience had created a network of support that extended far beyond the formal legal and medical systems that had addressed the immediate crisis. The foundation that had been established with the civil settlement funds was already funding its first grants for elder abuse prevention programs and survivor support services. My mother's leadership role in this organization had given her a sense of purpose and accomplishment that had transformed her from a victim into an advocate and resource for others facing similar challenges. The long-term care planning that we had developed during the recovery process had addressed not just the immediate crisis, but the broader questions about aging, independence, and family relationships that every family eventually faces. The legal documents, financial protections, and communication systems that were now in place would prevent future exploitation while ensuring that my mother's wishes and preferences would be respected, regardless of what challenges might arise. During the months following Lisa's sentencing, the ripple effects of our case continued to expand in ways that none of us had anticipated. The National Elder Justice Initiative had reached out to my mother asking her to serve as a spokesperson for their awareness campaign about family-perpetrated financial abuse. The organization had been impressed by her articulate advocacy and her ability to transform personal trauma into constructive action that could benefit others facing similar situations. The speaking engagements that my mother had begun accepting were taking her to conferences and workshops across the country, where her story was helping to educate professionals who work with elderly clients about the warning signs of exploitation and the importance of maintaining protective oversight without undermining autonomy. Her presentations had been particularly effective because she could speak from both the perspective of a victim and as someone who had successfully recovered and rebuilt her life. The collaboration with researchers at Arizona State University's College of Public Service and Community Solutions had resulted in a comprehensive study of family caregiving relationships and the factors that contributed to exploitation versus successful care arrangements. My mother's case was being used as a model for understanding how vulnerability intersected with family dynamics, financial pressures, and inadequate oversight to create conditions that enabled systematic abuse. The therapeutic work that my mother had continued with Dr. Martinez had evolved beyond trauma processing to focus on leadership development and public speaking skills that would support her advocacy work. The transformation from victim to survivor to advocate had required not just emotional healing, but also practical skills for effectively communicating complex issues to diverse audiences who might have little personal experience with elder abuse. The financial education workshops that my mother had begun conducting at Sunset Manor and other retirement communities were drawing large audiences of seniors who wanted to learn about protecting themselves from various forms of financial exploitation. Her ability to explain complex financial concepts in accessible terms while sharing personal experiences that illustrated the importance of vigilance had made these presentations both educational and inspiring. The relationship between my mother and the other residents at Sunset Manor had deepened beyond casual friendship to become a genuine community of mutual support and advocacy. Several residents had shared their own experiences with difficult family relationships or financial concerns, creating an informal network that provided early warning about potential problems while celebrating successes and milestones together. Helen Morrison had implemented a resident advisory committee that my mother now chaired, focusing on developing policies and procedures that would protect vulnerable residents while maintaining the independence and dignity that made the community attractive to active seniors. The committee's recommendations had been adopted not only at Sunset Manor, but were being shared with other retirement communities throughout the region. The medical monitoring system that had been established for my mother's diabetes management had become a template that Dr. Chen was recommending for other patients who needed intensive supervision, but wanted to maintain independent living arrangements. The combination of technology, professional oversight, and family involvement had proven so effective that it was being studied by healthcare systems in other states as a model for community-based chronic disease management. The legal precedents that had been established through our civil litigation were being cited in other elder abuse cases across the country, particularly those involving financial institutions and service providers who had failed to recognize or report suspicious transactions. Marcus Rodriguez had been contacted by attorneys in several states who were using our case as a foundation for similar lawsuits that sought to hold third parties accountable for enabling financial exploitation. The federal investigation that had grown out of Lisa's case had ultimately resulted in the prosecution of an entire criminal network that had been operating across multiple states, targeting elderly individuals through sophisticated caregiving, fraud schemes. The sentences handed down to other members of this network had been even more severe than Lisa's, reflecting the organized nature of their crimes and the extensive harm they had caused to dozens of victims. The victim support services that had been established through the foundation were providing resources not just for financial recovery, but for the psychological and social rehabilitation that was necessary for survivors to rebuild their lives and trust in relationships. The monthly support group meetings had expanded to include family members and friends who wanted to understand how to better support their elderly relatives while respecting their autonomy and dignity. The legislative advocacy that had grown out of our case was beginning to show results at both state and federal levels, with several bills introduced that would strengthen protections for elderly adults while providing better training and oversight for family caregivers. My mother had testified before both the Arizona State Legislature and a congressional subcommittee about the need for these reforms and the importance of balancing protection with independence. The documentary about financial elder abuse that had featured our story had won several awards and had been distributed to healthcare systems, financial institutions, and law enforcement agencies as a training tool for recognizing and responding to exploitation. The producer had contacted my mother about developing a follow-up program that would focus specifically on recovery and advocacy after abuse, using her continued journey as the central narrative. The academic research that had emerged from our case was contributing to a growing body of knowledge about elder abuse prevention and recovery, with particular focus on the role of family dynamics in creating vulnerability or protection. Several graduate students were conducting thesis research based on interviews with my mother and other survivors, exploring the factors that enabled successful recovery versus those that led to continued victimization. The financial literacy curriculum that my mother had helped develop was being implemented in retirement communities and senior centers throughout Arizona, with plans for expansion to other states through partnerships with aging services organizations. The program's emphasis on practical skills combined with real-world examples had proven particularly effective for helping seniors understand and protect themselves from various forms of financial exploitation. The technology innovations that had been developed to protect my mother's financial security were being refined and expanded by several financial institutions that recognized the growing need for elder-friendly fraud prevention services. The monitoring systems and authorization procedures that had been tested in our case were being offered to other customers who might be vulnerable to exploitation, with positive results in preventing fraudulent transactions while maintaining user autonomy. The professional training programs that had grown out of our experience were being implemented by healthcare systems, financial institutions, and social services agencies that wanted to better serve elderly clients while recognizing signs of potential abuse or exploitation. The interdisciplinary approach that had been necessary for addressing our crisis was being replicated in other communities through formal partnerships between medical providers, legal advocates, and financial counselors. The community education initiatives that my mother had launched were expanding beyond financial exploitation to address broader issues of aging, independence, and family relationships. Her workshops covered topics ranging from advanced directive planning to maintaining social connections, helping participants develop comprehensive strategies for aging successfully while protecting themselves from various forms of harm or exploitation. The mentorship relationships that my mother had established with other elder abuse survivors were providing ongoing support for individuals at various stages of recovery and advocacy development. Her ability to offer both practical guidance and emotional support was helping others transform their own experiences of victimization into opportunities for growth and service to their communities. The international attention that our case had received was leading to invitations for my mother to speak at conferences in other countries that were grappling with similar issues of elder abuse and family caregiving challenges. The universal nature of the problems we had faced was becoming clear through these cross-cultural exchanges, while also highlighting innovative solutions that were being developed in different national contexts. The research collaborations that had developed around our case were expanding to include international partners who were studying elder abuse prevention and recovery across different cultural and economic contexts. The comparative research was revealing both universal patterns and culturally specific factors that influenced vulnerability and resilience among elderly adults facing potential exploitation. The policy advocacy that had grown from our experience was contributing to broader discussions about aging, independence, and social support systems at national and international levels. My mother's testimony and written contributions were being cited in policy papers and legislative proposals that sought to address the growing challenges of supporting aging populations while protecting vulnerable individuals from harm. The personal transformation that my mother had experienced throughout this journey had been profound and inspiring to everyone who knew her story. The woman who had been found unconscious and abandoned 6 months earlier was now a confident advocate, skilled public speaker, and respected leader in the elder rights community. Her ability to transform trauma into purpose had created a legacy that would continue to benefit others long after our immediate crisis had been resolved. The ongoing relationship between my mother and me had become stronger and more authentic than it had ever been before the crisis. The honest communication, mutual respect, and shared commitment to preventing similar harm to other families had created a bond that was both personally fulfilling and professionally productive. Our collaboration on advocacy and education initiatives had given us meaningful work to do together while maintaining appropriate boundaries and independence. The ripple effects of our experience continued to expand in unexpected directions as my mother's story reached new audiences and inspired additional research, advocacy, and prevention initiatives. The transformation of our family crisis into a catalyst for broader social change had created meaning and purpose that helped heal the trauma while contributing to positive outcomes for countless other families facing similar challenges. The book project that my mother had decided to undertake was progressing steadily, with the assistance of a professional writer who specialized in survivor narratives. The memoir would detail not just the crisis and recovery, but the broader themes of family relationships, aging with dignity, and the power of community support in overcoming adversity. Several publishers had already expressed interest in the project, recognizing both its commercial potential and its value as an educational resource. The curriculum development work that my mother was doing with the University of Arizona's College of Social Work was creating training materials that would be used to educate future social workers, healthcare providers, and legal advocates about elder abuse prevention and intervention. Her contributions were helping to ensure that the next generation of professionals would be better prepared to recognize and respond to the complex situations that families like ours faced. The consulting work that my mother had begun doing with financial institutions was helping banks and credit unions develop more effective procedures for protecting elderly customers from fraud and exploitation. Her insights as both a victim and an advocate were proving invaluable for designing systems that balance security with customer autonomy and dignity. The nonprofit organization that had grown out of the foundation was expanding its services to include direct assistance for elder abuse survivors, providing everything from emergency financial support to help with legal proceedings and counseling services. My mother's role as executive director was allowing her to shape the organization's priorities and ensure that services were designed based on the actual needs and preferences of survivors, rather than assumptions about what might be helpful. The legislative testimony that my mother continued to provide was influencing policy discussions at multiple levels of government, From local ordinances that strengthened oversight of caregiving arrangements to federal legislation that would provide additional resources for elder abuse prevention and prosecution. Her ability to speak from personal experience while maintaining focus on broader policy solutions was making her an effective advocate for systemic changes that could benefit many families beyond our own. The training programs that my mother was developing for law enforcement agencies were helping police officers and investigators understand the unique challenges of elder abuse cases and the specialized approaches needed for interviewing elderly victims and building effective prosecutions. Her contributions were helping to ensure that cases like ours would be handled more effectively in the future, with better outcomes for both victims and their families. The media interviews that my mother continued to participate in were reaching increasingly large audiences with messages about prevention, recovery, and the importance of community support for elderly adults. Her appearances on national television programs, radio shows, and podcast interviews were helping to raise awareness about elder abuse while demonstrating that recovery and advocacy were possible even after serious victimization. The research partnerships that had developed around our case were generating publications in academic journals that were advancing understanding of elder abuse across multiple disciplines. The interdisciplinary approach that had been necessary for addressing our crisis was being documented and analyzed to help other communities develop more effective coordinated responses to similar situations. The support network that had grown from our experience was now providing services to families across multiple states, with regular online meetings and resource sharing that helped isolated families connect with others facing similar challenges. The peer support model that had been so valuable for my mother's recovery was being replicated to help other survivors and their families navigate the complex process of healing and rebuilding after abuse. The educational materials that my mother had developed were being translated into multiple languages to serve diverse communities that might be particularly vulnerable to elder abuse due to language barriers or cultural isolation. The recognition that elder abuse affected all communities regardless of ethnicity, income level, or educational background was driving efforts to ensure that prevention and recovery resources were accessible to everyone who might need them. The technology initiatives that had grown out of our experience were being refined and expanded to address different types of elder abuse beyond financial exploitation. The monitoring systems and communication tools that had been developed to protect my mother were being adapted for use in cases involving physical neglect, emotional abuse, and other forms of harm that elderly adults might experience from family, members, or other caregivers. The professional development programs that my mother was contributing to were helping practitioners across multiple fields develop more effective approaches for working with elderly clients and their families. Her insights were informing training for doctors, nurses, social workers, attorneys, financial advisors, and other professionals who regularly encountered elderly adults who might be vulnerable to abuse or exploitation. The community organizing work that had emerged from our experience was helping other communities develop local coalitions for elder abuse prevention and response. The model of bringing together healthcare providers, legal advocates, financial institutions, and community organizations was being replicated in cities across the country, with my mother serving as a consultant and trainer for these new initiatives. The policy research that was being conducted based on our case was informing discussions about broader reforms to social support systems for elderly adults, including questions about long-term care financing, family caregiver support, and the regulation of various service providers who work with vulnerable populations. The insights gained from our experience were contributing to evidence-based approaches for addressing these complex challenges. The international collaborations that had developed around our work were leading to cross-cultural research projects that examined how different societies addressed elder abuse prevention and response. My mother's participation in these global discussions was helping to identify best practices that could be adapted for use in different national contexts while respecting cultural differences in family relationships and caregiving expectations. The innovation in service delivery that had been necessitated by our crisis was being studied and replicated by other communities that wanted to develop more effective and coordinated responses to elder abuse. The integration of medical care, legal advocacy, financial counseling, and psychological support that had been essential for my mother's recovery was becoming a model for comprehensive victim services in other locations. The healing journey that my mother had undertaken was inspiring others not just to seek help when needed, but to recognize their own capacity for growth and contribution even after experiencing serious trauma. Her transformation from victim to advocate was demonstrating that recovery was possible and that survivors could play meaningful roles in preventing others from experiencing similar harm. As we drove home from the courthouse that afternoon following Lisa's sentencing, my mother reflected on how dramatically our lives had changed since that terrifying phone call 6 months earlier. The crisis that had seemed like an ending had actually been a beginning, opening doors to relationships, opportunities, and purposes that neither of us could have imagined when we were focused simply on surviving from day to day. The conversation during our drive touched on the upcoming speaking engagement that would take my mother to Washington, D.C. to address a national conference on aging and independence. Her presentation would focus on the lessons learned from our experience about balancing protection with autonomy, and the importance of maintaining family connections, even when disagreements arose about caregiving arrangements. The anticipation of this speaking opportunity reflected how completely my mother's perspective on her own capabilities had been transformed through the recovery process. The woman who had felt helpless and abandoned just months earlier was now preparing to address national policymakers and aging services professionals about solutions to problems that affected millions of families across the country. The planning for future projects that we discussed during the drive home included the expansion of the Foundation's services, the development of additional educational materials, and the possibility of establishing a training center that would serve as a resource for communities wanting to develop more effective responses to elder abuse. These conversations reflected the long-term vision that had emerged from our immediate crisis response. The gratitude that my mother expressed for the relationships that had been rebuilt and the new connections that had been formed was evident in her voice as she described the upcoming reunion with other survivors and advocates who had become close friends through their shared experiences. The isolation that had characterized her experience during Lisa's supposed caregiving had been replaced by a rich network of meaningful relationships. The sense of purpose that had emerged from transforming personal trauma into community service was providing my mother with energy and motivation that seemed to increase rather than diminish with each new project or opportunity. The advocacy work that had begun as a way to process her own experience had become a calling that gave meaning to both the suffering she had endured and the recovery she had achieved. The evening planning session that we held after returning home from the courthouse involved reviewing the calendar of upcoming speaking engagements, foundation meetings, and collaborative projects that filled my mother's schedule for the next several months. The busy calendar reflected how completely her life had been transformed from the isolation and decline that had characterized the period of Lisa's caregiving. The correspondence that had accumulated during the day included invitations to participate in additional research projects, requests for consultation on policy initiatives, and messages of support from families who had been helped by the resources and advocacy that had grown out of our experience. Each letter and email represented another connection that had been formed through the transformation of our crisis into community service. The reflection on the day's events that my mother recorded in the journal she had been keeping throughout. The recovery process captured both the satisfaction of seeing justice served and the continued commitment to preventing similar harm to other families. The journaling practice that had been recommended by Dr. Martinez was providing both therapeutic benefits and valuable documentation of the recovery and advocacy journey. The plans for the following day included meetings with foundation staff, a conference call with researchers who were analyzing data from the survivor support services, and preparation for the upcoming congressional testimony that would address proposed legislation for elder abuse prevention. The full schedule reflected the multiple roles that my mother had assumed as she transformed from victim to advocate to leader in the elder rights movement. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the "Mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out"